Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about the Empire in Total War Warhammer 3. The Empire is certainly one of the worst races in the game at the moment, and I've talked plenty about that, but what would I do to fix them? What changes would I make to fix the Empire? Now over here, this is a turn 39 campaign as Karl Franz. It's effectively over. I'm just preparing to launch a full-scale invasion of Sylvania with 2 stacks. I am going to go up against Vlad, but I am feeling like I am going to be able to win, partly because I already defeated Vlad once and I just accepted a peace agreement because it was convenient at the time to sort out some other issues. But let's talk about the Empire. What makes it so weak? And what makes it a situation when you're playing any other campaign of any other race that the Empire is a complete cakewalk for you to deal with? There are people who do migration campaigns like as Kugaf in the Empire because it's so easy to deal with. Not so easy to hold it together. And that's the thing I want to mention. The Empire should be the most powerful race in the entire game. Like, that's not even a debate, because they are the most powerful race in the setting, by far. Technologically advanced, not quite on the level of the dwarves, but close enough. Lots of troops, lots of good equipment. They fight on multiple fronts and they win on multiple fronts. Unlike other races, which are just like slowly but surely dying, like the dwarves, for instance, for all their technological advantages. But regardless, let's talk about what the issues are and how to fix them. Well, the first issue is with regards to Imperial Authority, and actually just the campaign systems in general, being Marcus Wolfhard and his hostility meter, Volkmar and his Books of Nagash. Like, if you want to play a campaign as the Empire that isn't destroyed by horrible systems, Volkmar is your best bet, but he still will have plenty of other issues. Problem with Books of Nagash, by the way, is down to the fact that you can't gain them through diplomacy, so you are going to end up having to fight factions that you would actually like to ally, and the books are actually really powerful. And you pretty much want them if you're playing Volkmar to really effectively win your campaign. So that's a major issue in his campaign. That should be fixed, because it also affects the Tomb Kings. It also affects Manfred, as much as we care about Manfred. Regardless, there need to be fixes for that. There need to be fixes for hostility. Like, hostility was always a crappy system ever since it was introduced. It was never fixed. It needs a fix. Like, Imperial Authority, Books of Nagash, and the hostility meter all need to be fixed. Like, with the problem with hostility, you're basically going to have to deal with it. You've got a perma debuff for the entire campaign that grows the more you conquer, and eventually comes to a head, spawns the Rogue Army. The Rogue Army is not the problem. The constant perma debuff control is actually a fairly significant issue. And then you got the Imperial Authority that both Karl Franz and Balthazar Gelt have to deal with. This is such a bloody nuisance. The reason it's such a nuisance is because it limits your diplomatic option with these minor Imperial factions, or all Imperial factions. So you can't get the defensive alliance, you can't get the military alliance, you can't use the allegiance system. The Empire would actually be far better, and actually is far better when you're not playing an Imperial campaign, because they don't have these limitations on diplomacy, so they can form military alliances with one another and end up actually being far better for it against all the AI factions. Effectively, it doesn't matter, like, say, if Hestus, who starts a war with Hochland, is butchering the people of Hochland, Talabayam is just going to sit by and let that happen. I understand AI aggression is something Creative Assembly has tried to move from, but there comes a point where it's ridiculous. And the reason that's happening is because of the severe limitations on diplomacy. Imperial factions can declare war on one another because they're locked behind Imperial authority, so you get an event. By the way, those events constantly break, so I would say the system needs to be removed. Fly out, just removed. There are some nice benefits, by the way, from the Elector accounts, but let me explain something. The High Elves and Kebie do this much better. So the High Elves and Kebie just rely on plain old diplomacy in their campaigns. They don't have a crappy Imperial authority. Sure, they don't have the benefit, if you will, of all the Elector account titles. Sure, fair enough. But High Elves are significantly stronger in a campaign. And they rely on good old-fashioned diplomacy. You've got free legendary lords in proximity to one another. You've got Nakari, you've got Noctilus as well to deal with. Ulf-1 is a powerhouse. The Empire is not a powerhouse. The Empire is a joke of a territory. And more often than not, like, Ulf-1 is generally worth getting as a territory. A lot of the Imperial territory is not worth getting. There's such a huge concentration of legendary lords, and you have such limitations in your campaign that even if you do take territory, it's generally going to be like tier 1, tier 2 territories. Whereas with Wolf One, you can get some really, really good cities over here. Like all of these settlements over here in Safri are tier 3 settlements at this point at turn 40. I'm kind of surprised there's no capital, but Safri is a minor faction and does seem to be fairly passive at this point. But still, you look at the game value, you look at Lawfern, they're both tier 4, Torivres, tier 4 as well. So that is kind of what you would expect in a campaign. And that makes Confederations worth it. There was a major overhaul to diplomacy in Warhammer 3. It's the best feature of the entire game that they added in Warhammer 3. It vastly improved the campaign compared to Warhammer 2, and this is the reason I would not play Warhammer 2 campaign. No other reason, really, not the legendary difficulty balancing, though that's also something that gets in the way, but really the limitation on diplomacy, and you certainly feel that if you try and play Warhammer 2 again. So, Wolf 1 does this better. Many other races do it better, but look at Kebie. Kebie, again, no limitations because of fealty or imperial authority. They just deal with plain old diplomacy. And because they have such diplomatic benefits in each legendary, like every legendary lord has a major diplomatic benefit, something that the Empire could also use, I might add. I mean, Karl Franz has 10, Kebie can get 40. Yeah, you might understand why Kebie is much better at diplomacy than Empire. It's kind of like pathetic. Okay, you can use electoral machinations, but this is a pathetic system compared to what the High Elves have. Like, the High Elf system is significantly better. I feel this should encompass the Dwarves and other races that are friendly to Bretonnia. This could affect things, but still. This system is just a joke of a system in a campaign. It's really pointless, because, like, Imperial factions are going to like one another. That's not the issue in your campaign. So you end up with a significant amount of prestige that you have absolutely nothing to spend on. Some mods use prestige for other things, like, oh, get a military alliance, or get a point of imperial authority, that kind of stuff. There are ways to use this system while still having it, but the limitations on diplomacy are just really stupid. The fact that you have fealty for every faction just doesn't end up working, and it makes for a miserable campaign, especially with a miserable early game. So the first 40 turns of any Imperial campaign are awful. If you get past that and you end up in a strong position, yeah, you're going to end up very strong in the campaign map, but you've won the campaign like maybe 10 turns ago. Certainly has been the case over here in this campaign. Whereas if you look at Kebie, the best experience of a Kebie campaign is actually the early game. You can end up dominating all of Kebie in like 20 turns, defeating Lokir, defeating Sneech, which are certainly not easy legendary lords to deal with, and then end up dominating the rest of the map. The limitation in a Kebie campaign is climate. The limitation in an Imperial campaign is every system of a campaign that they have to deal with. Also, the territory of the Empire can be difficult to navigate. All these small rivers make it so. Like, it's great if you're trying to conquer the Empire because you know it's going to be highly defensible. It's difficult if you're trying to defend the Empire across all of it. The fact that you have to care about the entire Empire from the start when you only have one army, really, it's like, oh, you should have to make difficult choices, but it's like, you're still losing Imperial authority, and it's like, the problem with Imperial authority, it's like, you might as well just cheese it. You want to know how you play an Imperial campaign? For anyone that's trying to argue the system is great, you go to Nuln, you may take Nuln, you may ignore Nuln, as I say. Let's say you're playing Gelt, because Gelt is better than Karl Franz, because the reason Gelt is better to play than Karl Franz is like, Karl Franz, when you're playing him, Gelt would do absolutely nothing, whereas when you're playing Gelt, you can confederate Karl Franz, he starts with an entire province, and he will actually defeat certain threats, like Khazrak, maybe even Festus. So that really removes a lot of pressure we feel. But if you're playing Gelt, so for instance, what you do is you deal with your initial threat, then declare war on Nuln, take Weisenberg, sell it to Averheim. There'll come an event next turn where you can get one Imperial authority if you force Averheim to give it back. You'll lose fealty for this, absolutely, but oh, geez. You'll lose fealty with Averheim, which is like a 2-region province that's not really worth it all that much. That's going to be ravaged by Srag anyway, so it's like, who gives a shit, essentially. And it's like, this system is so bad. It's not even a system where we care about the Empire. I didn't use that cheese in this campaign. It's still, like, freaking awful. And beyond that, you also have so many threats to deal with. So these limitations that the Empire has in terms of expanding their territory, having to preserve minor factions that are not worth a crap alive for dozens of turns. Whereas you've got Grom, you've got Kemler, you've got Vlad, you've got Draika, you've got Festus, the Changeling. Some of the most powerful legendary lords are all in the Empire, or close enough to the Empire. Or Azag is very close to the Empire, and his objectives are to take the Empire. We've got the entirety of Norsca. We've got Be'lakor. So yeah, the Empire's got a lot on its plate, with the limitation of like the Imperial Authority system needs to take a hike in a ditch. Like, just remove it completely. Let us deal with regular diplomacy. Keep the electric count system and the electric machination system. Just get rid of this fucking bar over here. Or keep the bar, if you will, but get rid of the limitations on diplomacy and allow us to confederate through plain old regular diplomacy. That would be a much better system. That's what makes Kefean campaigns and High Elven campaigns significantly better, even if they are sharing some similarities. Like, Kefei is actually just a lot of ways that what the Empire should be. I'm not even joking. Like, they have better economy, but they're better. They have better technology. They have easier access to that technology. They have better units from the very beginning of the campaigns. They have better campaign pacing. They have better campaign area to deal with. It's like, you want to play an Imperial campaign? Play Kefei. They play in many ways the way the Empire should be playing in a campaign right now. They just don't have a hero casualty replenishment, which is not great, but then every other way Kefei is significantly better. Magic, units, unit variety, actual variety in campaigns, well-designed campaign systems. Yeah, Kefei is better. So Imperial Authority needs to go and, yeah, do what the High Elves are doing, do what Kefei is doing. They create a much better campaign experience as opposed to the intern button simulator. That's pretty awful. The problem in an Imperial campaign on top of that is the unit roster. Oh yes, the unit roster. So the unit roster is just plain terrible. Archers are a DLC unit, by the way, and if you're playing an Imperial campaign without them, I'd recommend not to, because one, they're awful, but they're better than using spearmen. If you don't have archers, playing an Imperial campaign will force you to rely on crossbowmen, which are tier 2 unit, because every other unit you get at tier 1 is just not worth recruiting. Spearmen are like garbage tier units that might lose to goblin spearmen, especially when you consider the fact that all the greenskin upgrades they get early on buff goblins significantly. So it's like genuinely goblins would decimate them. Like, when the Empire has archers that are worse than goblins, you know something's up. By the way, thing about greenskins on the Lord, they're supposed to be crappy ranged fighters because they don't have discipline. So the fact that goblin archers are actually really good in this game is ridiculous. They're actually better because of the scrap upgrades and the early upgrades that you can get in a campaign. So tier 1 units, all of them worthless except archers, and archers are not good either. They're just the only unit that's worth recruiting. You might say, oh, free company militia. Yeah, but it's like they are decent enough, but they're gunpowder units, fire while moving, Vacre opponent, just not really worth it. Volkmar to an extent because he gets major benefits with them, but not really. Tier 2, you can get Empire Knights, but you do need a blacksmith for it. The Empire is one of the few races in the game where core units in your roster are locked behind the second building. Like, there's some other races that use this, Lizardmen for instance with some units, but for the most part, most races have moved past the system. This shows you how very little effort that Creative Assembly has put in the Empire, because this was the case in Warhammer 1. The fact that we still have the system so many years down the line shows you how much effort. Imperial Knight's decent, but the problem with Cavalry is, like, Cavalry won't win you sieges, and the vast majority of battles that are actually going to stop you in your tracks are not going to be field battles, they're going to be siege battles. And in siege battles, Pistoliers and Empire Knights, yeah, you might get a couple of them, but they're not going to be worth getting en masse. And honestly, getting this building requires a building slot, and yeah, that's a problem. I never bother with early game cavalry in an Empire campaign because of the siege situation. Tier 2, the only unit worth recruiting is like crossbowmen, maybe some spearmen shields just for flank protection, that's it. But like 2-4 spearmen shields, the rest of the crossbowmen, whatever heroes you can get. Regiments Renown, all that kind of stuff. Electric Count State Troopers if you have them available. I'll get into those in just a second, but problem is basically your entire infantry line is not worth recruiting. Like, your melee infantry line is worthless. Like, just for line holding capability. Like, if you put spearmen with shields against High Elven spears, which are tier 1 unit you can recruit without the barracks, they would lose. Let's not even compare with Silver and Guard. Halberdiers, which should be the mainstay of the Empire, yeah, they're too squishy. They can hold the line, they have armor piercing, they should be good, but really their lack of armor shows. The fact that a lot of Imperial units are using plate and have such crappy armor really shows. A lot of mods do increase armor. So yeah, I do think this unit roster needs buffs. And also on top of that, it's not just like the units themselves. They're cheap to recruit. But here's the problem with what Creative Assembly is doing, because a lot of the decisions Creative Assembly makes in terms of unit balancing are based on multiplayer. Problem is, These units are awful to use in a campaign, and they're too expensive for what they're offering. They're crap tier units that are too expensive in terms of upkeep. Not recruitment. Recruitment is low. It's the upkeep situation. Now you might say, well, Kislev has a similar issue. Yes, they do. You want me to compare a Kislev army of Kossars and armored Kossars versus a tier 2 or even tier 3 Imperial army? I'm going to tell you straight up, Kislev wins. They have better armored units. They have unbreakable range units that are better than Imperial archers. They have better upgrades. The research tree of the Empire is also a mess. But I'll talk on that in just a second. So yeah, the Empire unit roster does need a buff. Or it needs research available early on in a campaign. This is what the greenskins do. The greenskin units they have early on are crap. The way they work, the way the goblins work, is they're not inherently powerful. Well, Nasty Skulkers are crazy in terms of their melee damage, but not survivability. But the way they become powerful is through research. You don't have that kind of luxury in an Imperial campaign. And because of limitations on buildings, basically you're going to run around with archers, crossbowmen, and a couple of spearmen with shields until you get to tier 3. But things don't really get that much better in tier 3. You do need a tier 3 armory to recruit greatswords, which is really annoying, and greatswords are too expensive in terms of upkeep at 225 for you to maintain. You have a vast territory to deal with in a campaign from very early on. That's very unique. No other campaign has this much territory to have to worry about from the very start of it. The Empire has some of the most annoying camps. It's not the hardest. If you're telling me this is hard, no, it's about cheesing the shit out of the game. There's no campaign that's hard if you know what you're doing. It's just like, it's a really bad dynamic because you don't have enough armies. You have some really good units in the roster, but you don't use them because you want to maintain as many armies. Your economy is decent, it gets the job done, but Bretonnia has a better economy and better units, and they can mass more units, and they don't have supply lines. Yes, they have the peasant economy limitations, but there's ways around that. So basically, until tier 3, you're just recruiting archers and crossbowmen, and then you switch to huntsmen, which are better than crossbowmen in every way except armor piercing. They have a bit less armor piercing, but they do have firewall moving, they have vanguard deployment, they have stocks, so they're generally more useful. Greatswords are just too expensive to recruit en masse. You might recruit, like, say, 4 in an army, like I have over here, though that might be overkill considering I have a bunch of melee heroes, like 2 melee heroes in this case. But generally 2 or 4 greatswords, if you can even afford it. And because of the limitations on recruitment, it's not like you're going to recruit greatswords in every army. So the unit roster until you get to tier 4 is not great. Like, your entire melee infantry roster is not good enough for the job, either too expensive or too worthless, or both, actually, because, like, these melee infantry units, yeah, they're too expensive for what they're doing in terms of combat capability. Cavalry roster is good, but just not worth using, and besides, Knights of the Blazing Sign, I wish I could use these guys in a campaign, but their upkeep is way too high unless you control talent by them, and besides, you want to save up for Demigryphs, which are a better unit flat out in every way. You want to know why Bretonnia has the best cavalry in the game? It's not because they have better stats on melee, on cavalry on the ground. It's because they have flexibility. They have flying cavalry. They have anti-infantry cavalry. They have cavalry with few models that does very well. Kislev has better cavalry. The Empire not having good... the Empire cavalry is decent, but it's just not really that great. I mean, it's worth recruiting a couple of units if you actually bother with delivery. For instance, Outriders, grenade launchers can do a lot of damage, but it's not the field battles that's the problem. It's the sieges. You got a lot of settlement, you got a lot of provincial capitals to take, defend, all that kind of stuff. So it's like, getting cavalry, fully defensive, can work. Artillery is really where it's the problem. You need a dedicated building for artillery to get handgunners, and they're just not flat out not worth it because gunpowder units suck currently in Warhammer free. Some mods fix this. Recommend use those mods. You then look at tier 4. And by the way, those mods don't fix them for sieges. Sieges are still broken. Like, Radius really improves gunpowder units of Radius and SFO, for instance, vastly improve gunpowder units in field battles, but they still have problems in sieges. Problem is with an Imperial artillery situation, yeah, and this is the reason I've said that the Empire is a really bad artillery race, why I didn't rank them highly. It's like, oh, you got Telstorms and great cannons. What the fuck are you talking about? The Empire has great artillery. They don't. From a practical standpoint, they do not have great artillery because tier 4, you require tier 4 settlement to get that good artillery. And let me be blunt, by the time you get to tier 4, even if you rush it, you've won the campaign. Look at this campaign. It's turn 40. I'm only now turning Altdorf, and it's not like I've held back on growth. I had, I had growth buildings. I got rid of them to get warrior priests, because that's what you do in an Imperial campaign. The unit roster is so awful that the best thing you can do in a campaign is get a bunch of shrines of Sigmar, pump out as many warrior priests as you can, make entire stacks of them. Because infantry is worthless, so you need something to hold the line, something to do damage. These guys do damage in AoE with their Soulfire ability, so that's what you want to get in a campaign. This is, by the way, incidentally, why Volkmar is the best Empire builder of the Empire, and not Karl Franz, Marcus Wolfhard, or Geld, because he gets benefits to Warrior Priest. Though his early game is pretty miserable. Early game, Marcus Wolfhard is the best. Late game, Volkmar. That's all I'm going to say on that. But just the fact you don't have artillery early on, unless you play Marcus Wolfhard, where you get Imperial supplies so you can get Hellstorms, you can't believe how much more fun an Imperial campaign is when you have that artillery. Because it is powerful artillery, undeniably so. But the problem is, you need tier 4. Or you can take Nuln and make it a tier 3 for a landmark, but that's kind of going against the intent of the developers. I'm sure CA doesn't want us to just go on an Imperial Civil War from the beginning of the campaign, but that's the best thing you can do in a campaign. So, yeah, having artillery that's good in theory but not in practice is the problem. The reason I would rank even Bretonnia higher on the artillery scale is Bretonnia only has 2 artillery units, and they're just basically the same. They're just variants of the same unit. But the reason Bretonnia is better is Bretonnia has good siege artillery at tier 2, and artillery you can get in mass from tier 2. Kebie is slower, sure, but they do have cannons at tier 3. That's what the Empire needs. They need a cannon unit at tier 3. If not tier 2, they need a tier 2 artillery. Dwarves have tier 2 artillery. If you want to understand how the best way to play an Empire campaign is, play the fucking Dwarves. They do it better. They get a bunch of cross movements that are better than what the Empire has. They got artillery that's better than what the Empire has. And they get it earlier. For all their shitty growth, that Dwarves actually can get really powerful armies early on. The Empire is worse than Dwarves because, yes, you don't have the same shitty growth and you do get casualty replenishment, but your armies are vastly inferior. And while your growth is better than what the Dwarves have to deal with, because a lot of growth is tied to main settlement building, so while the situation with growth is better inherently in an Empire campaign, the fact you need tier 4 to get good units is a problem. It's an issue with some other campaigns, High Elves especially, but let's not compare High Elves. High Elves who have one of the best tier 1 unit rosters in the entire game versus the freaking Empire. Yeah. The Empire, which is just such a joke of a race. They haven't aged well at all. So the unit roster issues are a problem. What about the State Troopers? Well, they're good. They add some variety. But there's 2 issues with that I would fix. I would buff the regular roster, I'd make artillery available earlier on, and also, I would make Witch Hunters increase capacity at, if we're looking at Witch Hunters, I would increase their capacity at tier 3. That's what I would do with Witch Hunters, so you can actually use more of them. But if we're considering the State Troopers, here's the issue. Beyond the fact that you need to take the capital, so it means you're losing Imperial authority, and you're not resurrecting a faction, so you're not going to get as much Imperial authority as possible. Really, the best thing is to sack that settlement and take that settlement, sell it to Averheim. You get a lot of money, experience, all that, and you also get a lot of Imperial authority. The thing about the Electricon State Troopers, if we consider the Electricon, those State Troopers, and I'm using this army because I can see the recruitment, is you only get 1 unit every 15, 10 turns, whatever. You only get 1 unit of these guys. They're really expensive to recruit. They're really expensive to maintain. These are the blessed units of the Lizardmen. You know what's the thing about those blessed units? You can get multiple numbers of them stacking up in a roster, so you can recruit a lot of them very quickly. And 2, they're free to recruit. You get blessed unit, whereas with the Empire you have to pay money, and you can only get 1 unit every 15 turns. So yeah, the units are great. They spice up campaigns, but too expensive. Very expensive. Karaborg greatswords, regular greatswords are too expensive. Sometimes you just have no choice. You need that firepower. If you're going against Grom with I went to Gotrek and Felix against Grom with this particular army. I won, but sometimes you just need that particular melee combat capability in a campaign. By the way, just a side note, I deliberately played this campaign. It was not a fun experience. I would have said the exact same things had I not played it, but some people are you don't know how to play a faction X. No, I do know how to play them. They're awful to play. Like, achieving success is not a measure of how good the campaign is. You can win a domination victory as the fucking Demon Prince who's been wiped out effectively over here by Malice Darkblade, but that doesn't mean the Demon Prince is good. It is not quite the opposite, actually. Just because you can win against odds does not make a campaign good. Or just because you can beat the game doesn't mean that game is well designed. It is not. I'm not talking here about Warhammer 3. There's many games like that. You do have a huge roster of units and regiments renowned, so there's a lot of variety here, but I really wish there was more capacity for both regiments and renowned regular units, because the problem you have with all of this that I'm talking about here is you really lack unit varieties. Your army, like the early game, might look something like this. Like, this is the best Imperial army you can recruit. Well, I would obviously ideally have a bunch of crossbowmen, but since you won't start with tier 2 barracks, you probably are going to recruit a bunch of archers early on. And hey, do you want to throw out the recruits? That's why a mod like Warband Upgrade is such a great mod to actually use in a campaign. Didn't do it for this one, unmodded over here. Except Toggle Foggle War and all that. But still, no Warband Upgrade, stuff like that. There are mods that improve these things, but the fundamental issues of limited unit recruitment and lack of variety in the early game, a miserable early game, no mod fixes it. I've tried a lot of them. I can tell you this. This is one of the things neither SFO or even Radius fixes. Radius does improve things in this respect, because Radius is all about that early game aggression, so Radius is better. But it's not exactly like it does. Radius does improve things because, but the way they do that, and I'm pretty sure this was the intent, they buff the garrisons of settlements by quite a lot, so it makes it harder for the app. But that means you just steamroll the map, and that's not exactly great. I think there needs to be a challenge, but that challenge shouldn't be like, oh, the minor AI faction stood up to Vlad because the shitty Autoresolve did to massive garrisons. That's not a good campaign design at all. So, like, the Empire really needs a better early game units, greater variety in the early game, reasons to recruit, maybe even a better economy or just cheaper upkeep. Like, I would significantly lower the upkeep for things like great swords and other units in a campaign. That's what I would personally argue needs to be done in a campaign. And also maybe not have campaigns that you recommend Creative Assembly that you throw as the recommended campaigns. Because I look at Karl Franz's recommend campaign, I have to laugh at that. It's one of the, like, it's not the hardest campaign in the game, but certainly requires a great deal of knowledge about the game, its systems, and what to do and what not to do. And it's also a campaign. The problem with these systems, they're not teaching a player anything. Like, anyone who's playing the Imperial campaign is not learning how to play the game properly. They're either playing the intern button simulator or they're sitting on their ass, not doing anything, leaving the AI have all the initiative because they can't do anything. They don't have the resources, they don't have the units, they can't confederate other factions, they can't rely on them for military alliances. That's the problem. And also the way the current systems are of unit variety and Imperial authority force you to play. It might feel that you're forced to play in the Empire. Really, you don't. One of the things I did in this campaign, I went against the flow. I went over here and took Bastan, for instance, killed Grom with Karl Franz. Well, killed portions of it, dealt with him with some other armies, but still not a great experience to tackle in a particular campaign. So the early game needs to be better, and that's achieved with better campaign systems, no limitations on diplomacy that we currently have. Fealty needs to go, Imperial authority needs to go. Just replace that with the diplomacy system that every other race has to deal with. That's what I do for the Empire. And yeah, just cheaper units, artillery at tier 3 or even tier 2, like cannons tier 2, Hellstorms at tier 3. Like, if you want to add a landmark for Null, I mean, just keep it at tier 3 for Null. But yeah, add Hellstorms for tier 4 for everyone else. You'd still have reason to get Null for the recruit rank and the upkeep, ultimately, but you wouldn't have a reason to just annihilate Weselland. Yeah, a lot of these minor Imperial factions, either they get wiped out or they're too passive, they're not doing anything because they're hard locked on diplomacy. That also needs to be changed as well. So those are some of the issues. Climate is also an issue if you're playing Karl Franz. Supposed to go, like, if you're playing a campaign as the Empire and the Empire, don't play the Emperor because he's actually the worst one. Like, no joke, Karl Franz is the worst Imperial campaign to play. Like, if you're playing a campaign, play as Geld because you have better climate suitability, which is important. in a particular campaign. And maybe this is just my personal impression, but I feel there should be internal empire politicking, but I think the decisions you should be making as the empire in a campaign from very early on, like past turn 20 or so, should be about like, oh, how do I help the dwarves? How do I help the high elves? How do I deal with Norska? Now, how do I deal with, and of course, yeah, to deal with Vlad, but now how do I keep the half the empire from being demolished within the first 20 turns? Because that will happen. Maybe 3/4 of the empire. That shouldn't be the case of how a campaign plays out, but it is certainly the case at the moment. And that's fine. These are minor factions meant to be destroyed, but the fact Creative Assembly thought it was a great idea to add so many legendary lords in a situation over here that would screw you over. I mean, maybe the empire shouldn't be just like free for all for everyone to wipe out, but at the same time, how they'd balance that, I wouldn't know. I say Wolfon and Cafe achieved a better balance because there just not that many legendary lords. It's not like Nakari and Noctilus can't take Wolfon. Truth be told, they probably can't, but it's like most of the time, like Morathi intervenes. Like, I think the Wolfon situation is a better dynamic because, like, you have internal threats, but the High Elves generally beat them, but then you have external threats. That's the same situation for the Empire. It's just like the threats internally and externally are far, far greater, so the Empire rarely, if ever, achieves anything. Like Karl Franz, when he's played by the AI, may survive a long time. That doesn't mean the Empire is building up anything. Tyrion builds something. Xiao Ming builds something. Like, you can see Xiao Ming take... Like, it is conceivable for Xiao Ming to conquer half the map. The Empire might be so, but for other reasons, not because of its own merits. Where Xiao Ming can go toe-to-toe against Grimgor at one point and win AI on AI. That's just the kind of dynamic we have just because of bad racial design. And then beyond the lack of early game variety, the problem is with the variety of the systems is like it creates a really bad early game, and you have a campaign that basically is won or lost within the first 20 turns. Actually, might even be 10 turns. If you overcome those 10, 20, 30 turns, 40 turns, you've won the campaign. The sad part about that is like all that great univariety, like demigryphs, hellstorms, great cannons, all that's accessible after like turn 40, but you never get to experience an Imperial campaign. That's the fundamental thing I think needs to be fixed. There's some fun stuff. Yeah, there's minor stuff like heroes needed an update, skill lines, all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. Like Imperial captains are just like, they're a melee stick. They don't have anything special. The dwarves are in a better situation except replenishment and growth, but like dwarf heroes are great. Like you have a reason to use them. The magic heroes, yeah, they're magic heroes, but they don't got anything special to them. They don't have a special skill line. They've got some decent magic, but really nothing special with respect to that. There's nothing about the Empire that's special. You might say, oh, they have a lot of tools, but they don't. Realistically, they don't. This is the reason why Imperial factions are just such a rollover for everyone that starts a campaign or anyone that even goes in Empire later on. The unit recruitment is so restricted to like tier 4 settlements in so many ways or multiple structures to recruit units that it ends up in this kind of situation where, yeah, the Empire has theoretically a bunch of units, but practically it creates a situation where really even AI factions with all the cheats end up having very, very limited unit rosters available to them for recruitment. So you end up just fighting the same crap. The only thing that might be dangerous is a full-on outrider army, but even then, not necessarily so. There's many ways to counter that kind of army. That's the only real dangerous Imperial army you might encounter. You're not going to encounter an army of Hellstorm rocket batteries and all that in Empire. This is not the order tied to Warhammer 2. I think like some of the decisions were made because of that. I don't know. I think like CA needs to understand to some extent that Warhammer 3 was never going to play like Warhammer 2 just because of the inherent changes that were made, but they were really hard at work to counter the order tide. So that's why factions confederate far less. That's why the Empire is such a mess. That's why dwarves end up losing more often than not. Yeah, I understand. Order tide was not great. I get it, but maybe that was because a lot of the factions that were designed for that were not particularly great. Like Chaos was really crap, so Greenskins were really bad for a long time, but still. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more. Special thanks to Protossx, Vacre, Kebie, Fingo, JK, Alex, Alain, and Daniel, and to all of you who make it possible.